During the Warring States period, armies initially used, in addition to ground troops, in addition to infantry, a mix of chariots and cavalry. But cavalry eventually replaced chariots as the primary mobile arm, the same progression as in the Fertile Crescent. After the unification of China, there we go, warfare passed on to a third stage, characterized by defensive warfare on the northern border. The Han Dynasty began to construct long earthwork walls on its northern frontier, later connected into a single Great Wall. This construction continued for centuries. There were earlier frontier fortifications during the Qin Dynasty. We don't know much about them. The Han border fortifications were intended to deal with a nomadic mounted enemy. The elusiveness of these steppe-based nomads made it impractical for the Chinese to launch effective offensive campaigns against them. Despite their impressive appearance, the fortifications were not designed to be impenetrable. Their utility was to limit the frequency and penetrating power of enemy incursions and to provide early warning of large-scale incursions. These extensive fortifications could only have been constructed by a wealthy empire with a strong bureaucratic span of control, that is, the ability to reach out and authority to control a vast area and to extract money from that population in the form of taxes. This, in turn, reflected the need to create and control professional armies whose loyalty was assured by regular payments. For during the earlier expansion territory, loot from newly captured areas provided a sufficient reward system. Now, one might suppose that during this Warring States period, few positive developments occurred. But in its early days, a new ethical system swept many of the warring states, a system patterned on the ideas of Confucius, a philosopher whose life overlapped just slightly with the Warring States period. Now, other ethical and religious developments occurred as well, but Confucianism was the most important and the most enduring, and arguably the one that had the most effect on Chinese attitudes toward warfare. Confucius emphasized an ordered society based on mutual obligations that were changeless, no matter the specific circumstances. A son owed an obligation to his father, for example, even if the father was a cruel tyrant and abusive. That didn't change the son's obligation toward the father. Now, Confucius was a philosopher, and the system of thought he created should be understood as a philosophy rather than a religion, particularly since it took a detached view of heaven and emphasized the primacy of good conduct in this life. Confucianism stressed propriety, order, and the moral weight of good government and the capacity of good government to promote welfare and justice. One of his influential followers in later decades secularized a previously religious perspective called the Mandate of Heaven. Now, despite the name, it was under Confucianism an ethical rather than religious concept. And the idea was a virtuous government that instilled virtue in its population enjoyed the mandate of heaven, which is to say the moral right to govern. Governments failed, according to this theory, when they failed to promote welfare and justice, and then lost the mandate of heaven. Now, the key to proper behavior was to behave in accordance with the Tao. That can be spelled T-A-O or D-A-O. What it stands for is the way, sort of capital W. each individual had their own individual Tao. But in general, everyone was expected to show empathy toward others and to subordinate their own needs to those of the family and the community. There are a number of Chinese military treatises that are classics, and all regard the Confucian view of the state as based on virtue, not simply on power. Now, because this is a survey course, we're painting with such a broad brush that the wars in ancient China greatly resemble those that we already saw in the Fertile Crescent and also in ancient Greece. But there's one striking difference. In those regions, war was seen as a normal activity and was largely celebrated by those in positions of political or cultural power. The Chinese attitude toward war was strikingly ambivalent, something that comes through clearly in the writings of Sun Tzu, whose famous treatise, The Art of War, reflects the military values of the warring states or stage two period. Now, Sun Tzu was a Chinese general who may or may not have been a real figure, but the Art of War reflects the worldview of Confucius, which would place it no earlier than about 450 BCE and more likely sometime between 400 and 320 BCE. Now, Chinese historical writing represents a clash between principles. The first is what's called Wen. You're going to really need to remember these terms because they're important. So the first is Wen, which represents civilization and culture. And Confucianism regards this as good. It regards it as the sort of the normative state of a society. Then there is Wu, which is stands for war and force, or connotes war and force. Wen was, of course, much the preferable principle. And so Chinese historical writing, unlike its Western counterpart, greatly underplays the role of military force in Chinese history. In other words, after this warring states period ended and China was united, the scribes that wrote down the previous history of the area that would become China, without sort of ignoring the fact that there were wars, tended to play down the significance and certainly the moral significance of these wars. Now, Sun Tzu reflects the military values of the warring states period. And the peak of warfare, of course, during this very warlike stage two period. He viewed warfare as necessary, but at the same time as a disturbance of the Tao. And thus, its use should be kept to a minimum. Here's a famous quote from Sun Tzu's Art of War. Look at this. No state, he wrote, has ever benefited from a long war. Those that garner 5 victories will meet with disaster. Those with 4 victories will be exhausted. Those with 3 victories will become hegemons. Those with 2 victories will become kings, and those with 1 victory will become emperors. And the idea is, if it takes 5 victories for you to win a war, that is such a disturbance in the Tao. The Wu, the power and force period, is so protracted that it upsets if it does not overthrow the mandate of heaven, a kingdom's right to govern. The same thing is true with 4 victories, 3 victories. Sun Tzu begins to have a positive attitude toward that. 2 victories, of course, better still. Those with 1 victory, those who can win a war in a single battle, are the ones that will become emperors, the way that Sun Tzu talks about it. And according to the Art of War, the best way to settle a dispute is without fighting, to settle it by diplomacy. The second best is by dirty tricks, assassination, the bribing of enemy officers, they come over to your side, and so on. Only after those techniques fail should one go to war. And in that case, wars won in a brief campaign with a limited number of battles, as this quote essentially states, are best. The worst way to conduct a war was by resorting to besieging cities, which was a long, drawn out, and costly process. Force, Sun Tzu maintained, was to be used carefully, no more or less than necessary, and in short, sharp bursts directed against the weakest parts of the enemy's force in order to overcome them as quickly as possible. And he expressed this idea with the admonition, throw rocks at eggs. Now, finally, warfare was very important in the early history of the region that became China. It was a significant element in the region's early religion, that's during the ritualized stage of warfare. But for our purposes, it's important to note more that China was literally a country made by war, the warring period in general, and particularly the victories by the Qin dynasty that finally created a unified China. And so by 1 BCE, China, the Han Empire, was about the same size as Rome, but better consolidated politically and culturally. Yet, although war had been fundamental to the creation of both empires, the role of military power and prestige differed dramatically. Afterward, as China during the Han Dynasty shifted to the strategy of the satisfied power, much like Egypt, war became much less central to the worldview of the Chinese elite. And the sense of violence as a disturbance of the Tao increased. And there was an increased sense that the need to resort to war represented a failure of statesmanship, that wise statesmanship could foresee and address threats through diplomacy, through bribes, and so forth, just like Sun Tzu said. War was not to be spoken of with pride, nor were military heroes and deeds of martial prowess to be glorified. Very different from Western civilization, although they were tolerated or even considered necessary in the broader scheme of all things under heaven. Only recently have scholars rediscovered the importance of war in early China, because for so long this importance was obscured by the scribes and the contemporary historians of early China. That's all for this lecture, and now I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint presentation, and the way I'm going to go about that is by stopping the recording. So.